Welcome to VoteProPot-Cast, brought to you by VoteProPot.com. Today we have as our guest Dr. David Bearman, physician, author, and one of the world's foremost experts in cannabinoid medicine. Over his more than 40-year career, Dr. Bearman has distinguished himself as a subject matter expert and a sought-after speaker in the fields of medical marijuana, pain management, and drug abuse treatment and prevention. His book, Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, examines the dubious origins of America's drug laws and the very real medical benefits of cannabis. His awards and affiliations are, quite frankly, too numerous to mention, and we are thrilled to have him with us today. Dr. Bearman, welcome to Vote Pro Podcast.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's very nice to be with you.
Now, your career, as I read it, began in a time and place that, for many, has become almost synonymous with drug culture, wouldn't you say?
I would. Actually, my career started first in Seattle. I was just talking to a patient here who was from Seattle, and then after I graduated from medical school and finished my internship, I went to San Francisco, which is, I think, what you were referencing, and there certainly was a lot of psychoactive drugs around the Haight-Ashbury. That is for sure.
That is for sure. What kinds of substance abuse did you encounter back then, and what did treatment consist of generally?
Well, that's an interesting question. One of the things that we found curious when we started the Open Door Clinic in Seattle in 1968 was the high percentage of kids that came to us not with drug problems, but were runaways. Uh-huh. And I think that there is a relationship there. I think if you grew up in a dysfunctional home, your chances of having a substance abuse problem are really accelerated. Right. When I got to San Francisco, I first volunteered at the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic, so we didn't really talk too much about substance abuse problems. But then I became the co-director of the Haight-Ashbury Drug Treatment Program, and at that time there was a good deal of use of methamphetamine, and we saw during my time as the co-director there, we saw several hundred people who wanted to stop using methamphetamine, and I think we did have some success in helping them to stop. Of course, they'd already made the first important step by deciding that they wanted to stop using meth.
Uh-huh. So, as a young physician back in those days, how would you describe what your attitude was toward the drug culture and toward the people who were involved in it?
Well, I think I was fascinated by it, and clearly there was a desire to change. I mean, the preeminent thing that was on everybody's mind was the war in Vietnam, and as a college student and medical student, one of the last things that I wanted to do was to be drafted and go to Vietnam and be shot at by, as Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali said, I don't have anything against those people.
Understandable.
And the fact of the matter is that the war in Vietnam was likely the same reason as the war in Iraq, and that was oil. There's an enormous amount of oil in the Spratly Islands. Mm-hmm. So there was an effort, and a pretty successful effort, and actually somewhat accurate, to tie the substance-using subculture to the anti-Viet War activities. And in fact, that's why cannabis was placed in Schedule 1 by Richard Nixon. It was an effort to try to marginalize one of his largest opponents, and that is the anti-Vietnam War activists, many of whom were students and many of whom who used cannabis. So, I mean,
very true.
Being in the Haight, I was very familiar with the people's use of psychoactive drugs, and there was a lot of discussion about, the value or lack thereof of LSD or psilocybin, and it was pretty much a given that just about anybody that was a young person at that time would be using cannabis. And in fact, when I ran the clinic in Isla Vista, which we called the Isla Vista Open Door Clinic, felt that since I was one of the people that helped start the Seattle Open Door Clinic, I could appropriate that part of their name. And I did a little survey one time of 50 consecutive patients, and 85% of them had used cannabis, and very large percentages had used other psychoactive drugs, including not only LSD, but also opiates and benzodiazepines and stimulant drugs.
You have appeared many times over the years as an expert witness in court proceedings, correct?
Over 500 times.
500 times. What sorts of questions are you called upon to testify about?
Well, some of them are pretty straightforward. The easiest ones are, was this person under the influence of cannabis or other drugs at the time that they got this ticket? Other times it's, was this person using drugs in such a fashion that it would interfere with their ability to raise a child? I've been an expert witness in cases where we've defeated Child Protective Services who, for no other reason than that the person used cannabis, wanted to take their children away from them.
Unbelievable.
Also been involved in automobile accidents where I remember one in particular was a woman in Ventura, which is right down the road here, and she tipped over in her truck at a place where they often had accidents, and she had been prescribed a painkiller and a muscle relaxant, and they tested her, and she tested positive for the painkiller and the muscle relaxant. Well, what a surprise. She'd been prescribed that and taking it for a year. So what I asked was, had she gotten a DUI previously with that combination of medication? No. The answer is no.
Okay.
No previous accidents? No. Did anybody see her before she left for work that day? Yes. Her husband and her 16-year-old daughter, did she do anything out of the usual that day? No. Well, then, why is it that you're saying that she was driving under the influence of a drug? And I think one of the things you need to educate prosecutors on is that the mere presence of a substance in your bloodstream doesn't mean that you're impaired. If we're talking about cannabis here, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says there's no increased risk of accident with the use of cannabis. And you compare that to, say, driving with a passenger doubles your risk of accident. And the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration also has said that if you are impaired, you tend to drive slower and more carefully. I guess that's why it doesn't increase your risk of accident. And there's no relationship between your blood alcohol or your blood THC level and being impaired or not being impaired. And these are basic facts that law enforcement often gets confused. One piece of advice to your listeners is, if you're ever stopped and asked to do a field sobriety test, just tell them no.
Okay, that's good news you can use.
Because the field sobriety test is not science. There's no normal baseline that's been tested with people who are not under the influence of any drug. It's highly subjective. It's not science. It's junk science. But to a jury, it sounds impressive. And so your best bet is to avoid doing that. You're really just giving ammunition to the people who want to lie about your condition. I've had cases where people have been arrested for speeding, and they used cannabis more than 24 hours before, and they tried them for driving under the influence. And, of course, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says you drive slower and more carefully. The complete opposite of being stopped for speeding.
Right. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I've become absolutely fascinated by is that part of human physiology known as the endocannabinoid system, or the ECS. Right. Could you give us a brief description of what that is, how it works, what its significance is?
So the THC, the chemical structure, molecular structure of THC, was characterized in 1964 by a famous Israeli researcher named Raphael Mechoulam. And he and many others in Europe and the Middle East began to work on finding why the THC has an effect on the body. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they discovered the endocannabinoid system. Now, the reason it's so hard to discover is that the neurotransmitters, the body's own marijuana-like stuff, the anandamide and 2-AG, are metabolized very quickly after they're produced, and they're sort of produced on demand. The demand might be that you have pain, or the demand might be that you're beginning to have a migraine or something like that, and your own body's endocannabinoids will increase. The endocannabinoids, the neurotransmitters, affect two neural receptors, not two creatively called the CB1 receptors, which are largely found in the brain but are also found elsewhere in the body, and the CB2 receptors, which are largely found in the immune system. But they, too, are found elsewhere in the body. And then the body does have a couple of enzymes, abbreviated FA, fatty acid anhydrase, and MIGEL, and I forget what MIGEL stands for. And these enzymes metabolize the endocannabinoids as well as the phytocannabinoids, phyto meaning plant or plant-based. Right. And there's a third source of cannabinoids, and that's synthetic cannabinoids. A lot of people don't realize that THC has been legally available in the United States since the mid-1980s. It's called Marinol. The generic name is dronabinol, and it was developed at the encouragement of the federal government because they were upset that people with HIV/AIDS were getting benefit from cannabis, and they didn't want to have to say that cannabis was something that was useful.
Unbelievable.
And they did not let the people who developed THC to extract it from the plant, which would have been cheaper. They had to make it synthetically so that they could say, well, no known medical use for the marijuana plant, even though there's 4,000 years of history, more than 4,000 years of history, that cannabis is a medicine. And as Dr. Donald Abrams, who's an oncologist at UC San Francisco, has said, except for the period from 1942 until 1996, cannabis has been a medicine for over 4,000 years.
Unbelievable. That's absolutely. Now, I'm also fascinated by, we hear so much about THC and CBD. What other cannabinoids do you see as having a lot of promise?
That's a good question. There are a tremendous number of other cannabinoids. First off, we have to look at the raw plant when all of the cannabinoids are what's called the acid form. And that doesn't mean that they have some kind of psychoactive moiety, quite the contrary. They have a double-bonded OH group attached to a carbon, and that's called a carboxyl group. And that when you have a carboxyl group, that compound is called an acid. And so all of the cannabinoids are in the raw plant as acid form with a carboxyl group. And many of them do have therapeutic value. THCA, CBDA, CBNA all have therapeutic value. Other cannabinoids that have been mentioned are CBN and CBG, THCV, and these are all variations on a theme. I mean, you've got 21 carbons, and then you have different structures, either a double-bonded O or an OH hydroxy group that's connected with that, or you may have other substances that are connected to the base molecule, and if you take a look at the therapeutic benefits of these, many of these have therapeutic benefit. One of the things that Mechoulam said about the constituents of the plant, and plants are complicated. Coffee has 880 molecules. Tomato has 380 molecules, whereas cannabis has 512 molecules. Okay. And so what Mechoulam talks about is having a the entourage effect, by which he means the combined effect of all of the therapeutic constituents of the plant. The whole plant is more effective than any specific isolate of that plant. So if you're just taking THC or if you're just taking CBD, you're not getting the benefit of the whole plant. THCV is interesting in that it's an appetite suppressant as opposed to THC, which stimulates the appetite.
Right.
CBG is an anti-cancer drug. CBC is an anti-cancer drug. CBG is also anti-inflammatory, as is CBD. So we really need to take a look at the whole plant, and what you're seeing now is people drilling down and looking at not only the cannabinoids, the so-called lesser cannabinoids, but also looking at the terpenes, the thing that give the plant its unique odor.
Right.
And terpenes are the most common molecule in nature. There are more than 20,000 terpenes in nature,
wow.
And there are 200 terpenes that are in cannabis, and many terpenes are found in citrus fruit or pepper, pine trees. It's a very ubiquitous molecule, and if you think about the aromatherapists, they have recognized that these aromas do have therapeutic value. Some of the terpenes are useful in dealing with pain, some are useful in dealing with anxiety, some are useful in terms of sleep. Linalool, which is from lavender, can help you sleep, can help you relax. Some people like to have lavender candles that they'll burn at night. And it's not just a pleasant odor, but it's something that can have medical value, that can be therapeutic and beneficial. A person would be well advised, a young person would be well advised today, if they were interested in research and in the medical field, to do research on the cannabis plant, because it has such a broad spectrum of therapeutic applications, and it has so many moving parts. And we are learning more and more about cannabis. And I think I'll let you ask the next question, because otherwise I'll just ramble on here.
Well, we love the rambling, and it's very informative, but I'll go ahead with the next question. Now, in your book, Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, you explained that virtually every civilization throughout history, and you mentioned it goes back thousands of years, has had some form of psychoactive drug use.
Absolutely.
And your book also discusses the idea that psychoactive drugs, using them to achieve altered mental states, can actually be a healthy thing. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, and that is an idea that was put forth many years ago by Dr. Andrew Weil, who wrote The Natural Mind. He also wrote From Morphine to Chocolate. Dr. Weil, when he was an intern in San Francisco, also volunteered at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, and he lived down the street from me. Dr. Weil now is the chairman of the Department of Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, and his books have sold a lot more than my books has, so he's very well known. But one of the things that he mentioned is he spent a year in the Amazon, is that the people that live there think that altered states of consciousness are really important, so they encourage their teenagers to use psychoactive drugs so that they will be able to recognize what an altered state of consciousness is, and hopefully in their minds that they would then be able to generate that altered state naturally, without the use of substances. And these altered states tend to be spiritual, and frankly, I think that most modern religion are based on psychoactive drugs. And I say that because the Zoroastrians, which is ancient religion, came up with many of the concepts that are used in contemporary religion. And the Zoroastrians used soma, and there's been a long argument over thousands of years as to what soma was. I sort of take the coward's way out and say it's probably any one of a number of 8 or 9 things, and probably all of them, depending upon where the followers of Zoroastrianism lived and what psychoactive drug grew there.
Right.
The Zoroastrians came up with the concept of the devil, the unitary God, heaven, hell, and the last judgment. Mm-hmm. Now, the Jews, and I'm Jewish, but the Jews say that they were the ones that came up with the unitary God. But it turns out that in the 6th century B.C., the Babylonians, who practiced Zoroastrianism, captured a bunch of Jews from Jerusalem and took them back with them to Babylonia. And they stayed there for about 60 years. And during that time, I'm guessing that they did have some discussions with the locals about their spiritual beliefs, and that this led to incorporation of the unitary God into Judaism. I mentioned this once to a rabbi, and he said, well, you're right. The Jews didn't mention it until after the 6th century, but we always knew it to be true. We just didn't talk about it. I thought that was a very clever rabbinical response.
Well, that's what I guess he's paid to say. But very interesting to reflect on that. Now, I want to get to the legal aspect real quick before I let you go. The DEA drug scheduling, as you know, defines Schedule 1 drugs as those that have A, no currently accepted medical use, and B, a high potential for abuse. Now, in your expert opinion, doctor, and I think we'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in the world with more clinical experience and knowledge on the subject than yourself, when it comes to cannabis, are either of those things true?
Absolutely not.
I didn't think so.
You go back to the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, and who testified against it? The American Medical Association. Well, what did they know? In the 1920s, American physicians wrote 3 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis. As late as 1937, they were probably writing hundreds of thousands of prescriptions a year that contained cannabis, and there were 25 to 30 over-the-counter patent medicines that contained cannabis. And the AMA said, the AMA knows that no dangers from the medical use of cannabis. And they were well aware of its use. It was in the United States Pharmacopoeia from the 1850s until 1942. I mean, basically, the reason that we have the laws today about cannabis are largely due to the petrochemical industry, with a boost from racists. And who are these people embodied in? One would be Lamont DuPont, and the reason I finger him is there's a good deal of circumstantial evidence that he was concerned in the mid-1930s about competition from hemp because a harvesting device that had been invented some years earlier, the patent was running out on it. It cut the labor in half to prepare hemp for industrial use. This would put hemp products in competition with some of the things that DuPont made, like nylon, which is made out of...
Nylon rope, right.
Made out of cellulose. Rayon, made out of cellulose. And, of course, the waste product of the hemp is the hemp hurd. What is that? Cellulose. Also, DuPont had the patent for sulfites to make paper, but you need 4 times as much of the sulfites to make paper out of wood pulp as you do to make paper out of hemp. They also made an additive for gasoline, tetraethyl lead, and they were the largest shareholders in General Motors. Why is that important? That's because Henry Ford Motor Company, always thought that cars should run on ethanol, preferably hemp ethanol. And in the late 30s and early 40s, he had a prototype car that was made almost entirely out of hemp that ran on hemp ethanol.
That is hilarious. And I find that really fascinating because I've kind of heard that before, but I never, you're the first time I've heard somebody with some expertise on this to actually make that claim. And I've heard, I think that's just fascinating that a hemp car running on hemp ethanol. What more could you want?
If you haven't actually read my book, read it, because that story is in there, and there's a lot of very interesting anecdotes. One other thing about books, I'm going to be sending out a press release on my newest book, which is called Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine. And if people want to know more about that, they can Google my name, David Bearman, Bearman, and you'll find those books there, and you also will find a number of videos that I'm in. One of the best videos was done by Lindsay Ward, entitled Medicinal Cannabis and Its Impact on Your Health. It's very well put together by the documentarian. It has some archival footage of Nixon declaring the war on drugs, of Governor Schaefer saying that cannabis should be legalized, and a number of other interesting clips that are in there. It takes about 45 minutes to look at that video, and according to Mr. Ward, it's been translated into 11 different languages.
Well, we will find them, and we will put as many of those links as we can in our show description, as well as a link to your website, Dr. Bearman, and to the book.
What's really sad here is the enormous amount of money that we have wasted, basically because of the oil companies and because of racists like Harry Anslinger. And we have cost a lot of people their lives, or at least an early demise, because as Dr. Abrams has said, there's more than enough basic science research and anecdotal reports to justify doing double-blind studies to demonstrate whether or not cannabis can cure cancer. And we have had one of those double-blind studies. It was done in England with 25 milligrams of THC, 25 milligrams of CBD in a whole plant alcohol extract given 3 times a day, people with glioblastoma. The people who got conventional treatment for glioblastoma, they lived 330 days, and people who used cannabis in addition to conventional treatment lived 40% longer, or 180 days more. These kinds of things have consequences, and the laws that we have passed that have been based on nothing but hyperbole, and nothing but hysteria, nothing but racism, nothing but fear of competition by various industries, not only including the oil industry, but also the fabric industry and the pharmaceutical industry, have created an enormous loss for the United States in the billions upon billions of dollars we spent enforcing these laws, the millions of lives that have been ruined, and frankly, the empowerment of the Middle East, because if our cars were running on hemp ethanol, like Henry Ford wanted us to do, we wouldn't be reliant on Middle Eastern oil, and the incredible problems that we have internationally would be a little bit more manageable.
Well, this is exactly why Vote Pro Pot exists and why we are so adamant with Vote Pro Podcast about getting this out. Dr. Bearman, I hope we can have a discussion again sometime. There's so many more topics I would like to get deep into with you. In the meantime, we were going to, like I say, put your links up on our show description. And any other parting thoughts before we let you go?
No. If I give you parting thoughts, we'll never get off.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Very much our pleasure, Dr. Bearman. Thank you for joining us on Vote Pro Podcast. Post your comments, your questions, your corrections, your historical insights on anything and everything related to the world of cannabis. Just check us out at VoteProPot.com.
And you can go to our contact page and send us a message or email us at podcast@VoteProPot.com.
And please like and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and now Instagram. Just do a search for Vote Pro Pot.